We'd like to begin now with this morning's first panel discussion, Will RMB Internationalization Transform the World's Financial System? This session will be moderated by Nobel laureate and Fung Global Institute Academic Council Chairman, Professor Michael Spence. He will be joined by his panelists, Professor Robert Aliber, Professor Emeritus of International Economics and Finance at the University of Chicago, Mr. Akinari Hori, Special Advisor and a member of the Board of Directors, the Cannon Institute for Global Studies, and Ms. Helen Wong, Group General Manager and Chief Executive, Greater China, HSBC. So if our panelists could please make their way to the stage.
Victor, Peter, ladies and gentlemen, I'm thrilled to be here with you this morning. I've had the privilege of being involved with the Fung Global Institute since its early days. It's been a very exciting journey, and I think the next phase will be even more exciting. I thoroughly endorse what Victor and Peter said. I think this is, to understate it slightly, where the action is. I am Michael Spence. I'm sometimes impolitely described as a former economist. And I'm very honored to be here to moderate this panel. On my left is Professor Robert Aliber. He is Professor Emeritus of International Economics and Finance, a giant in his field. At the University of Chicago, he is largely responsible for the building out of the international dimensions of the MBA program and other parts of the school. Akinari Hori is a special advisor and to an important think tank in Tokyo, but he is also a central banker, serving in the Bank of Japan for many years and has great insight into these things. And Helen Wong is the chief executive of HSBC China and the group general manager of HSBC overall. Is that correct, Helen? And we're thrilled to have her to give us some insight into what the internationalization of the renminbi means for HSBC, for the financial system, for business, what opportunities and so on it creates. Now, I suspect not everybody in this room knows what the internationalization of a currency means. I suspect you're here in part because you'd like to understand that better. But when you get to be the dominant trading country in the world, your currency and your financial system start to have a very large influence, not only on the country, on Hong Kong, but on the entire global economy and financial system. So our goal this morning, in conversation with each other and relatively shortly with you, is to try to sort of shed light on the various dimensions of the internationalization of the renminbi, what it means, how it relates to the development of the Chinese economy and its financial system, how it will affect trade, how it will affect Hong Kong, what business opportunities there are, and so on. So that's our goal. We're going to go in the order in which we appear here, with Bob starting out to give us a sense, based on his long research, of what this means. And then Akinari will help us understand the international monetary system and what it means to have a currency become international in that context. And I think Helen will take over and tell us a little bit about what it looks like from the point of view of a major financial institution operating in this system. So with that brief introduction, Bob, let me ask you to take the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back in this exciting city and this first-class university. I was here about 3 weeks ago at a seminar sponsored by the Ronald Coase Institute, I think at one of your other campuses. I'm a fan of the literature on sports, and one of my heroes is Yogi Berra. Yogi must have been thinking about Hong Kong when he said it's so expensive nobody can afford to live there. Or when you come to a fork in the road, take it. Or if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. When I teach at Chicago, I ask at the beginning of every quarter, for the first class, I ask the students, and most of my students have been second-year MBAs, think of the course that you've had the previous quarter, the previous X, that you got the most out of. And I give them 30 seconds to self-select. And then I hand out, figuratively, a blue book and say, write down the central ideas in that course. You can do this experiment with yourself. And after about a minute, I call on the bright student in the front row and say, Mike, how many ideas did you write down? And the almost universal answer is 2. And then it becomes playful. What was the tuition in the course? $5,000. 5,000 over 2 is $2,500 an idea. How many hours did you study, Mike? 100 hours, 100. I have 2 ideas that I want to talk about today. The first idea is that a currency is a brand name. The dollar and the Coca-Cola are both brand names. When one thinks about the internationalization of the RMB and whether the RMB will become a reserve currency, the question is, how will a relatively new entrant into the market gain acceptance? And that raises questions on both the supply side, actions that can be taken in Beijing, in Shanghai, and elsewhere, but it also speaks to the demand side. So we could imagine that I'm the financial manager of the Norwegian Wealth Fund, or I manage the reserves of Kuwaiti, or I manage reserves in Moscow. I need to be convinced that the ownership of the RMB, a relatively newcomer in the competition among global currencies, that the purchase and acquisition of the RMB will be rewarding to the people whose wealth has been entrusted to me. So that's the first idea. The second idea comes from America's greatest pop artist, Andy Warhol. Now, we know about Andy and Maryland Times 1000 and the American flag and the Campbell's soup can ad, but he's famous for a quip. Everyone is famous for 15 minutes. And I've taken that quip and bastardized it to say every country grows rapidly for 30 years, or maybe 40 years. Britain grew rapidly from 1830 to 1870. The United States went to the head of the league along with Germany from 1870 to 1930. Japan grew very rapidly, actually 2 periods of rapid growth, but the most recent was from 1950 to 1990, and then its growth rate fell very sharply. China has had 30 brilliant years, just brilliant years, 10% growth rate, in a way very much like Japan. But I want to suggest that 30 years is over, that China has used up most of its years of very rapid growth, and that leads to 2 related questions. What will the transition be like from a period of 7, 8, 9% growth to one of 2, 3, 4, 5% growth? And then what will the actual growth rate be like after that transition? And that clearly, the second question has implications for the first. So let's come back to the first question, a currency as a brand name. And so if we think of the roles of international currency, we can think of the Dutch guilder that preceded the British pound as an international currency. You remember that Thomas Gresham went to Amsterdam to borrow the money to finance the fleet to defeat the Spanish Armada. The pound becomes a global currency in the middle of the 19th century, and it has 100 years, 50 as a ascending global reserve currency, and then a declining role. The US dollar begins to become a reserve currency at the end of the 19th century and flourishes. The dollar has remained the dominant reserve currency. And one of the things I find most fascinating is that despite a series of stupid mistakes, that's stupid in capital letters, by Washington, the relative position of the dollar as the dominant reserve currency has not declined significantly. And one interpretation is that the benefits of networking, of having a dominant currency, are just so strong that it is very difficult for their number 2 or number 3 brand to capture market share from the number 1 brand. Now, that's not a permanent truth. Obviously, market positions change. Yesterday, I was coming in from the airport and asked the driver, what's the car? A Mercedes. And then I got him talking about the Lexus and the efforts of Toyota to position the Lexus to essentially take brand leadership away from Mercedes. And that's failed. That's failed. It's very hard to topple brand leadership, although it happens. One can think of the Sony-Samsung competition. If 20 or 30 years ago I said Samsung was going to take leadership from Sony, one would have said that was a very unlikely event, but it's happened. Now, when we think of the role, the international role of the RMB, and ask the question, should the RMB, is it in China's interest for the RMB to become a reserve currency, we can reflect on the US experience. Has it been rewarding or costly for the US dollar to be a reserve currency? We can ask that question at a time when the US dollar was pegged to gold, the 1950s and the 1960s. And we can ask that question subsequently, when most currencies have been floating in terms of the US dollar. Let's look at the market events of the last several years. The price of the Japanese yen has fallen by 20%. Japan is trying to increase its growth rate by increasing its trade surplus and its current account surplus as a share of its GDP. That may be in its own interest. Within the last year, the price of the euro has fallen by 25% relative to the dollar, even though the inflation rates in these two economic units are more or less the same. Before this price change occurred, the Eurozone countries had a current account surplus of 2% of GDP. Japan wants to have a larger current account surplus. Europe wants to have a larger current account surplus. There's a global consistency problem. If both of these areas are to be successful in having a larger current account surplus, somebody else is going to have a larger current account deficit. And we know who that somebody else is. That's going to be the United States. Is it in the US interest at this time to take in the dirty laundry of Japan and Europe simply because they want to have larger current account surpluses? That will have adverse impacts on employment in the US tradable goods industry, and it will have adverse impacts on the US fiscal deficit because profits and employment in the tradable goods industry will decline. That's the sort of question that should be asked in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Beijing when one thinks about, do we want the RMB to become an international reserve currency? Now, if one thinks that one wants the RMB to become a reserve currency, one has to come back to this issue: how do we position the brand? How do we increase the likelihood that the manager of the Norwegian Sovereignty Fund will want to acquire securities denominated in the RMB? That's a risk-return consideration. The manager is going to ask the question, if I have a dispute with one of the Chinese banks, or if I have a dispute with with a broker in China, how will that dispute be resolved? How much trust can I put in the Chinese judiciary system? What confidence can I have that my interests will get a fair hearing? My interest as an outsider will get a fair hearing in competition with the insider. So trust, it's a delicate issue, but it's a very important issue. And those who think that the RMB should have a larger or much larger role in the international economy should be thinking of the measures that can be adopted to increase the trust of foreigners in the judiciary institutions in China. Now let me come to the second issue, the anti-Warhol view. Every country grows rapidly for 30 years. Periods of rapid growth occur as labor moves from the farms and villages to the cities and to the factories. The excess labor on Chinese farms has been largely exhausted. I'm prepared to make the bet that there's no one between 7 and 70 other than cripples. The Chinese farming has done a marvelous job in providing for the food needs of a much larger population and for a much richer diet. But the growth rate is going to fall. There is a tremendous excess capacity in the housing market. The Chinese economy is going to have to adjust to that excess capacity. The demand for rebar is down, the demand for cement is down, and China is at the beginning of a massive adjustment. One of the issues that lots of people in Beijing are going to have to face is, what should our currency policy be? Should we allow Europe and Japan to gain a competitive advantage by reducing the price of their currencies, even as our domestic employment is increasing, or should we join the parade and undertake measures to allow for an orderly reduction in the price of the RMB? So let me conclude. There are two dominant issues, questions that I want to leave you with. One is the dollar and the Coca-Cola and the RMB are both brand names. And we should be thinking about the types of measures that might be adopted to increase the foreign demand for RMB, if that is the objective. We should be thinking about the costs and benefits of having the RMB as a global currency. And we should also be thinking of the very difficult transition that this massive Chinese economy is going to be making in the next 3 to 5 years as it adjusts from a period when it has grown from 7 to 10% to a much lower growth rate. Thank you very much.
Very much. That's very, very helpful, I think, in setting the frame. I think the issue comes up in part because China has become an enormously large and important part of the global economic system. And one of the things we're seeing is that trade is being settled increasingly, not dominantly yet, but increasingly in the Chinese currency. And there's a set of issues about whether one wants to go further down that road in the way you described. So let me ask Hori-san to take over and help us understand the phases of and issues associated with the evolution of the international role of this currency.
All right, Mike. It's a great pleasure for me to come to one of my most favorite cities in Asia, to which have come many times. Thank you for your invitation, Victor and Bill Overholt. Having heard Bob Aliber make very interesting remarks, I have, of course, more agreements than disagreement. But let me start with one disagreement about European and Japanese policies. He said they are aimed at, gain competitive advantage to increase current account surplus or whatever. Both the ECB and the BOJ are try to kill the threats of deflation. Particularly in the case of Japan, they wanted to, bring inflation rate a little higher. Exchange rates are just the variable or consequence of their inflation targeting policy. So was the US. It was the US Fed that began QE ahead of two central banks. Well, so much for the disagreement, actually. And I agree with Bob's understanding of currency being a brand name. Let me spend a few minutes about starting with the facts about international monetary scene. Although my conclusion is similar to Bob's, I don't think I can be as entertaining as he was, but let me try. Let me pick up a few facts of the international currency market. I don't know whether you are familiar with this, but daily turnover, I'm speaking of the global forex market amounted to $5.3 trillion. That's daily, okay, in 2013. That's the most, that's the latest surveyed figure done by the BIS. And the BIS, Bank for International Settlements, shows its currency distribution by percentages, where, whose total being 200% rather than 100% because it takes a pair for any exchange of currencies. Okay. On that basis, the US dollar captured 87% in the 2013 survey. The dollar's proportion actually remained virtually unchanged at 90%, a little less, since the BIS began this survey in 1989. Okay. The second and third currencies actively traded on the global markets are the euro and the Japanese yen, each capturing 33% and 23% respectively. In 1989, the Deutschmark, French franc, and other European monetary systems currencies had a combined share of the same 33% as the euro in 2013. Okay. The Japanese yen had a share of 27% in 1989, the peak year of the Japanese bubble economy, which dropped to 17% by 2007, but recovered to 23% in 2013. Okay. So, in short, the international currency market has hardly changed as far as the distribution of major currencies is concerned, despite a repeated concern over a decline in US dollar status in the international monetary system. The dollar has continued to play the vehicle currency role for the global currency market. Okay, during the past decade, the renminbi's presence increased dramatically. In 2001, the renminbi ranked 35 on the currency league table with a negligible percentage share, but moved up to rank 9 with 2.2% share in 2013. However, other emerging economies' currencies also increased percentage shares. For example, between 2001 and 2013, the Mexican peso from 0.8 to 2.5%, Brazilian or Russian ruble from 0.3 to 1.6%. Well, many other examples, actually. By the way, the Hong Kong dollar's share declined from 2.2 to 1.4% during the same period, which suggests some substitution effects by the internationalization of the renminbi. Well, in a nutshell, despite salient increases, the presence of emerging economies' currencies is still pretty small in contrast to the size of the GDP and international trade of goods and services. The underweight of the renminbi is particularly conspicuous in this regard. Now, in order for a currency to be used widely in the international market, Jeff Frankel of Harvard pointed out several conditions. 1, the economic size of the economy. 2, developed financial markets. 3, confidence in the value of the currency. 4, inertia. The renminbi obviously meets the first condition. However, the economic size does not immediately entail a wide international use of the currency. Take the US dollar, for example. As Bob Oliver said several minutes ago, it was in the 1860s or early 1870s that the US economy overtook the UK economy, but the market remained unconvinced about the international currency role of the US dollar. Around that time, German economy also overtook the UK, but like the US dollar, Reichsmark failed to impress the market, and sterling continued to be the international vehicle currency. It was only after the First World War that the dollar began to glitter, and only after the Second World War was its overwhelming status established. Now, financial markets. In recent years, the Chinese government has been decontrolling both domestic financial markets and cross-border capital transactions step by step. However, there is a certain skepticism as to the extent to which this liberalization goes. The Chinese government or the Communist Party appears to be reluctant to accept totally free flows of capital or full liberalization of financial transactions, both at home and cross borders. They seem, at least to me, particularly cagey about outflows of domestic capital. In my opinion, market confidence matters a lot for an actively used international currency. It is not only confidence in the value of a currency, but confidence in its integrity that matters. The integrity of currency is maintained only when the function of the currency goes smoothly as means of exchange, unit of account, and store of value. To be a little more specific about the requirements for the integrity of currency, the monetary authorities have to create and maintain a system so as to ensure reliable means of payment and wide, deep financial markets, supported by, for example, banknote counterfeit deterrence capability, legal stability and transparency, as well as law enforcement capability over financial fraud and other wrongdoings. On all accounts, there is a long way to go before the renminbi gains confidence in the market. Actually, I have one footnote to put to this conclusion concerning not the renminbi, but the US dollar. In recent years, the US government has been actively using its clout over the global financial system as economic sanction against Russia, Iran, and other countries. It was reported a few months ago that the US might even try to limit Russian banks' access to SWIFT. SWIFT is the global message transfer system of interbank transactions. If such financial controls were used widely for foreign policy purposes, I'm afraid it would damage the market confidence in the US dollar, thereby depreciating its supreme status in the global financial market. Let me take up a few specific issues, if I may. Central bank currency swap arrangements. Some central banks have swap arrangements with other central banks. For example, Central Bank of Canada, England, Japan, ECB, and US and Swiss have standing swap arrangements with each other to provide domestic currency against the counterparty's currency. The BOJ also has bilateral swap arrangements with several Asian countries. At the height of the global financial crisis of 2008, the Fed agreed to have emergency swap arrangements with many foreign central banks to provide the dollar liquidity, and so did the BOJ, the yen liquidity, with the Bank of Korea. Shortly after these episodes, People's Bank of China also signed swap arrangements with central banks of Korea, Malaysia, Belarus, Indonesia, and a few others. Those countries apparently faced shortage of foreign exchange reserves, and the renminbi swaps were sought to augment their reserves at the time of pressing need. Because the renminbi was not freely usable for international transactions, however, actual utilities of the yuan created by the swap lines were limited to payments to China. In a sense, these swap lines were prepared as a safeguard or cosmetics against speculative market attacks on their currencies, and I don't know if these arrangements were actually activated to create the renminbi. In more recent years, the Bank of England, ECB, and other central banks of developed countries have opened up swap arrangements with the People's Bank of China, which are, unlike the swap I mentioned, these new ones are intended to enhance the renminbi liquidity in its offshore banking markets in those countries so that the renminbi clearing can be done smoothly. In 2009, the PBOC officially launched a renminbi clearing bank system in Hong Kong, which was followed by similar arrangements in Singapore, Frankfurt, London, and many cities in Asia, most recently in Sydney. Generally speaking, offshore markets are the flip side of the coin of underdeveloped home markets. The renminbi offshore markets are no exceptions. Think about, if the renminbi were freely usable inside, outside China, banks would make their clearing of their renminbi balances at the accounts held at the PBOC or their corresponding bank's accounts there, which makes the payment final. In particular, banks located in time zones similar to Beijing's, they don't have to go through clearing banks, because if the renminbi were freely usable, they could do payment settlement business within daytime working hours, and therefore there will be no point to do such business in offshore center where the finality of payment is not assured. On the other hand, banks in remote time zones may find some merit of settlement with the designated renminbi clearing banks, because the renminbi is not globally used currency, therefore not CLS currency, some mechanism to decrease risks involved in exchange. In other words, renminbi offshore centers are a means to cover deficiencies in the home markets to some extent. In order to push the internationalization of the renminbi more substantially, it is essential for the Chinese authorities to lift virtually all exchange controls in home markets. In this regard, the real test concerns the Shanghai Free Trade Zone, where the renminbi exchange transactions are expected to be liberalized considerably going forward. Now let me take up a few more. AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I think AIIB makes sense. Asia is ample with both savings and investment opportunities, and there is room for improvement in financial intermediation there. Actually, it was this consideration at 11 central banks in Asia Pacific that led them to embark on a project called Asian Bond Funds a decade ago to enhance the function of bond markets in emerging Asian economies so as to channel their rich savings nicely into investment opportunities in Asia. I was the chairman of the committee responsible for this, for supervising ABFs for 4 years until 2010. By the same token, the AIIB can funnel Asian savings into Asian investment opportunities in infrastructure. There is additional merit in the AIIB at the present time, where Basel III and other regulatory requirements tend to restrain commercial banks from extending credit to large, riskier projects. Well, in order for the AIIB to be successful, there are many technical aspects to examine: assessment of asset quality, funding capabilities, asset liability management, which are no different from the conditions for a good commercial bank. In order to become a good bank, the AIIB will need qualified professionals for each important department. Why don't Japanese experts join it? That's my personal view. SDR. Australian dollar captures 9% of the global forex market, 4 times larger than the renminbi. Each of the Swiss franc and Canadian dollar has more than twice the share of renminbi. None of these currencies are included in the SDR basket. So I think renminbi's inclusion is way too mature, although G7 and IMF may be making a political decision in its favor prematurely. What's the merit of renminbi becoming an SDR composing currency for China? Well, besides an aspect of national pride, I see no practical benefit. SDR is a unit of account at some international organizations, but practically nothing more than that. There is no scope for private use of SDR as means of payment because there is no settlement mechanism in kind. Even for an investment currency, there is no client base among small investors whose utility function depends on their home currency, or global investors who can create their own currency mix tailor-made. Bob's friend, former friend because he's the late Charles Kinderberger, referred to the SDR in 1985 as something like Esperanto for a language, which I thought to be a very pithy remark then, and I continue to do so 3 decades later. Thank you.
The SDR stands for special drawing right. It is the unit of account in the IMF for transactions that involve central banks. And the reason it comes up now is that China has expressed firmly a desire to have the renminbi included in the basket of currencies. There are now 4, I believe, the US dollar, the euro, the yen, and the British pound, to be included in that, whether or not that's largely symbolic or other things, but there are conditions associated with being in that basket. And those conditions have a great deal to do with the openness of the capital account, the ability to flow money in and out of the Chinese financial system and so on. So I think that's why you emphasized that as part of your remarks. Helen, what does all of this look like from the point of view of somebody who deals with it every single day?
Thank you, Mike. Just want to say a warm hello to all of you. It's my great pleasure to be back in the university as an alumni. Great memories. When I was here, of course, this hall wasn't here, but good to see the university develop to a stage that it is now. I missed the centennial celebration because I was working in Shanghai then. Also today, I think it's also great pressure because coming back very much like a student with two professors on stage, and as a banker with a central banker on stage, give me a lot of pressure. I thought my two fellow panelists have talked about the big picture and appreciate, I think those are very good thoughts about a currency. And we talk about RMB so much, in particular in Hong Kong, because we almost use it as legal tender today when we go out to shop. But maybe as a banker, I can focus back a bit more on the use of it. Because as a bank, we look at the flow of RMB, the use of it, the payments, the exchange every single day, as Mike just said. So what is RMB internationalization? We have to define it because we do have a project in the bank looking at it. So how do we define it? In a way, we generally say that how do we effect the use of RMB around the world? So comes the word internationalization. But if you talk to the bank, the central bank in China, the PBOC, when they first talk about it or actively talk about it, they don't use the word RMBI. They use RMB cross-border settlement, because that is exactly what they're focusing on, is the cross-border payments of RMB, because in the past, RMB is not freely flowing across the border. So to an extent, when we look at the RMB internationalization, we always talk about a three-stage development. So the first stage, the massive use of it is for trade settlement. And then the second stage would be to use RMB as a payment for investments across the border. And then the third one, obviously, is when the central banks around the world would use RMB as a reserve currency. So how has RMBI, I mean, allowed me to use that term because the word internationalization is a very long word. So how has RMBI developed over the years? I would say it has come a long way in a relatively short time. Just allowed me to look at my notes to give you some landmark years. I think it is indeed 2004, 11 years ago, when Hong Kong became the first mover in this. Because you remember at that time, Hong Kong people are allowed to buy RMB or sell RMB with a quota every day, 20,000, and that was lifted actually last year. And then it becomes faster when we actually see some liquidity develop in Hong Kong, because at that time I think a lot of investors buy RMB in view of its appreciation. So when some liquidity is around in 2007, we see the first dim sum bond being issued. Dim sum bond is a bond denominated in RMB and settled in RMB. So actually, the first one was issued in Hong Kong in 2007. And people in the industry was debating what name do we give this bond. Because I remember when we started talking about the Hong Kong dollar market, we called the Hong Kong dollar bond the Bohemia bond. So it's interesting, someone wants to attach a very Chinese favor to this RMB denominated bond, and it's called dim sum bond. So interestingly, today we have RMB denominated bond issued in Korea. It is now called a kimchi bond. From there to 2008, I think we did talk about currency swap. So PBOC entered into the first currency swap. I think that was with Korea, if I remember correctly, in 2008. And then the major thing is trade settlement in RMB, and that began in 2009. And Hong Kong again played a very key role as the first of the few cities that started this with China. And then we have what we call the RQF, so renminbi denominated qualified foreign institutional investor scheme that was launched in 2011, just 4 years ago. So foreign countries are given quota so that they can use whatever liquidity they have in RMB and invest into the markets in China. Well, and obviously the famous Shanghai Free Trade Zone, 2013, September, I remember so well, allowing much more cross-border RMB flows based on more simplified procedures. And then the Stock Connect linking Shanghai with Hong Kong last year, I think quite a number of us here perhaps have already invested in Shanghai based on this Stock Connect. And indeed, just 2 months ago, we have witnessed the expansion of the free trade zones, and now we have free trade zones in Guangdong, in Tianjin, and also in Fujian. So a lot of things happened over the 10 years or so. But now looking at data, in 2011, 7% of China's trade was settled in RMB. By last year, it was 22%. HSBC is of the view that by this year, 30% will be settled in RMB. So, of course, trade of China is the largest size in the world, and 22% of it is already a very big number. And in 2011, combined capital denominated in RMB flow, ODI plus FDI, so the investment in and out of China, was about 110 billion RMB. In 2014, 3 years later, it was over 1 trillion. So that was a 9-fold increase. And in 2008, the dim sum bond issuance was 12 billion RMB. And in 2014, it was 527 billion RMB. So a 44-fold increase. So we start from small number, but the development is very, very fast. So a lot of people ask me, Helen, when do you see, with the use of RMB across the countries and the world, when is China's capital account being, open, and we have RMB full convertibility? Well, I think nobody has a really, say in this. But if we really look at China's capital account, it is perhaps more open than many people think. Because based on IMF's definition, we found that only 4 out of 40 items are not convertible. So the rest are either basically convertible or partially convertible. So if I continue to talk about it, probably I'd be saying too much, but indeed, we see that RMB is already a major trade currency, and China has been encouraging the use of RMB as investment currency as well. So then we have to think about, okay, is it just China pushing it? So, well, every transaction, there has to be 2 counterparties. So a lot of times we talk about one side is in China, then the other side must be outside of China because we're talking about cross-border. So if we really look at foreign RMB hub, Hong Kong obviously is number 1 offshore center for RMB, with RMB deposits close to 1 trillion RMB. It's actually a bit more than half of the world's RMB outside of China. But you also see that quite a number of other countries are developing capabilities in RMB. For example, Singapore, for example, Taipei, for example, London. And at this point of time, I think, if I'm not wrong, 12 countries have already got RQFI quotas, and half of them have started, more or less, to invest using RMB into China. And then, of course, we have clearing banks appointed around the world handling the settlement of the RMB cross-border in those cities or in those countries. We probably is more interested in Stock Connect as well, because I think even though the quota hasn't really been entirely used up, I think the true value of the Stock Connect lies in it being a testing ground for direct market access. So it has enabled China to refine the model and apply the lessons learned to other exchanges and asset classes. So it will not be surprising in the future there will be direct connect in other financial products. And we all hear that a new link between Shenzhen and Hong Kong is being planned, and its trading is set to begin later this year. So, and another extension of direct market access is the recently announced mutual recognition of funds. So in the future, in Hong Kong, we will be able to buy funds that is developed and registered in China, and vice versa. China people investor can buy funds actually started in Hong Kong. So having said all that, maybe one point that people would also ask, what do the free trade zones do? And in particular, what do perhaps the closest one, the Guangdong free trade zones, do with Hong Kong? Well, China is experimenting with capital account liberalization through the free trade zones. I think when Shanghai Free Trade Zone was first established, after a few months or so, we hear quite a lot of complaint. People were saying that we do not know what exactly can be done in the free trade zone, and it seems to be slow. Transactions are not plenty. So what exactly is the free trade zones doing? So the answer is actually quite simple, because people forget the word pilot. The Shanghai Free Trade Zone is a pilot zone. It's actually in the name. So it's called the China Shanghai Pilot Free Trade Zone. So actually that zone is used to experiment different ways to do things. So a lot of times we talk about simplification of how we handled import and export, and then gradually banks can offer various different ways of doing things. Today, if you have an account in the free trade zone, in Shanghai Free Trade Zone, you are a corporate, you can swap what we call swap the funds, the RMB funds across the border, and you can actually pool payments together, so to make it a lot more efficient. So Guangdong Free Trade Zone, in our view, certainly will deepen economic links with Hong Kong and Macau, and it will actually be talking a lot about financial innovation. So hopefully Hong Kong, being so close and being part of it, will be able to play a major part. And I had actually prepared to talk a bit about the One Belt, One Road, but since the AIIB has already been mentioned, I guess we perhaps would just leave it behind. I think this is a very exciting development, I must say, for bankers, because we are going to see yet another currency become really important in the world. And to a large extent, if China opens up further and the currency is fully convertible, it is not unthinkable to say that RMB will become one of three reserved currencies of the world alongside the US dollar and the euro. But in regards to timing, anyone can have a view. Thank you.
This is an important moment, although this happens continuously, in a number of respects. And I want to mention three and ask you to reflect on how these things relate to the internationalization of the renminbi. First, for much of this period of extraordinary growth, China was the supplier of goods to the world. It's becoming a major market in goods and services for a wide range of countries, including other developing ones. Second, if I've got the data right, and Helen mentioned this, the foreign direct investment and the overseas direct investment. Last year, for the first time, the outbound direct investment in real assets by Chinese companies exceeded the inbound. And this is reflective of a very important stage in the development of the Chinese economy. There are great companies that have for many years been largely domestic who are about to become global brands and major investors in assets all over the world. And I assume, Helen, as a global bank, part of what drives you is serving your customers and moving where they go. So I'd like you to reflect a little bit on that aspect of it as well. And the third thing is that China, for the first time, has a pretty coherent, vigorous foreign policy with an economic component. as reflected in the building of institutions like the BRICS Bank, the AIIB, the Silk Road, and the, I can never get the terminology quite straight. There's two belts or one belt or one piece of silk or something, but anyway, you sort of get the idea that China has the intent to use its enormous capacities, including investment capacities, to be a major positive force in the development of a wide range of countries running from East to South Asia and on through Central Asia all the way to Africa. And that's, I think, also in ways that I can't completely see through related to the internationalization of the, well, the whole operation, but in addition, the currency. So could I ask you to, any of you feel you want to comment on that, just say something about how that relates to the internationalization issue?
I think the One Belt, One Road. I think we must have read so much about the One Belt, One Road. It's the belt. I think sometimes people confuse the belt and the road, because the road is actually the sea road, not the land road. The belt is the land road. So the belt is the linking China towards the west along actually the old Silk Road into Central Asia and to Europe, and then the road is the sea road when China sort of like sells out through Southeast Asia, maybe the rest of Pacific, and then through to Middle East and South Asia, Middle East and Africa, etc. So a lot has been talked about it, but I think simply put is China indeed has over the years developed so much and has been encouraging a lot of its enterprises going out. So the going out policy has been there for some years. And indeed, China has, I think people read, overcapacity and also plenty of reserves. So China will be able to use quite a lot of this, exporting its capacity, in particular to countries in Asia, where infrastructure work is in great needs. China actually also has a lot of experience in infrastructure, as we all know, because China has been really building a lot. When people talk a lot about China's building, perhaps people sometimes ignore the fact that China actually needs a lot of infrastructure, not just real estate, because of urbanization. China's urbanization is moving rapidly to the score of 60%. And too many cities have many people, but without a good system. So if you're just talking about roads, high-speed trains, we talk about underground, etc., China needs a lot of it. A lot of studies will talk about China in maybe another 10, 20 years' time, we'll have 200 cities of over 1 million population. So infrastructure is not something new to China. So China will be doing that. It's exciting to the banking world on the One Belt, One Road initiative because by now the AIIB already has 57 founding members and will have, I think as we read, something like $50 billion as capital to allow the bank to go out along the One Belt, One Road to support development of infrastructure. So it means perhaps equally, if you finance $1 for $1, something like 50 billion of a business waited to be done by banks around the world or any other type of investor, because the AIIB can issue bonds. So if you're institutional, if you're an insurance company, you can purchase the bonds. And then hopefully it will create a lot of jobs, and then hopefully it would stimulate domestic spending along the way in those countries. So it's indeed a very exciting phenomenon, and I would guess that banks around the world would look forward to seeing it happen and play a role in it.
As I said 10, 15 minutes ago, AIIB makes a lot of sense to me. And, particularly at the time when commercial banking world or investment banks are reluctant to take up large risks, whereas there are huge, investment opportunities in Asia. Well, AIIB makes a lot of sense. My knowledge about One Belt, One Road is limited, but if it's tangential to this AIIB projects, funneling savings of Asia, particularly China, to Asian infrastructure investment opportunities, that would be great. But does it have anything to do with internationalization of the renminbi? Well, in a remote way, it may promote internationalization of the renminbi. But in my view, it's not so directly linked. First of all, China's central bank has more than ample dollar liquidity. Foreign exchange reserves amounted to over 3 trillion dollars, or almost $4 trillion. So if I were the central bank of China, I would prefer to have more tangible real assets outside the country rather than continue to hold on to U.S. treasuries. 3 trillion, $4 trillion more than necessary for working balances at a time of contingencies. So, better to put money for more productive projects like One Belt, One Road, and payment perhaps is to be done by U.S. dollars. Substitution for exchange reserves in dollars makes more sense to me rather than paying in renminbi. So this is one thing. Another thing, as Professor Aliba said, international use of the yen is more demand determined. It really depends on whether foreigners like to hold renminbis. In order for foreigners hold more renminbis comfortably, as I said, liquidity. I mean, you can get rid of renminbi and to change to US dollars, Japanese yen at any time. That's why you hold renminbis. If there are a lot of restrictions of exchanges, then you try to be cautious about holding renminbi instruments. So, therefore, the relationship between AIIB, BRICS banks, One Belt, One Road, and the internationalization of renminbi, I consider it to be more remote than direct.
Final question from me. There is a fair amount of commentary that runs along the following lines, that if you go back to the WTO session, that was preceded by a set of agreements with respect to opening up the economy, and was viewed, I think, by the people who knew what was going on as a way to promote a pretty aggressive and, with the benefit of hindsight, very successful reform agenda. People have said that the internationalization of the renminbi requires a set of developments and reforms in the Chinese financial system to which there is perhaps some internal resistance, and that moving in this direction is a way of accelerating a set of things that are not really focused on an international agenda, but rather on building a financial system within China that will support China as in its next phase of growth and development. I think everybody in this room knows it's a financial system that has been dominated by banks that are essentially state-owned, that there are issues with respect to diversity of savings channels, access to credit, and so on. that are kind of mainstream reform issues within China right now. Bob, do you think that this is in part a way of promoting an important reform agenda within China, and that rather than sort of somehow wanting to be a global currency brand is the underlying motivation?
Thank you. I think we should sit back and ask, what is it we want to achieve? And there's a little, I think, too much attention to achieving an increase in GDP. So if I were to answer that question, I would say we want a higher standard of living for Chinese households. We want access to better medical care. We want more and varied educational opportunities. We want to increase the lifespan. We want people to have secure retirements. We want greater safety in the air and on the rivers. We want to clean up pollution. So let's begin to focus on these components of household living standards, and then begin to think of what are the prices that can be changed to enable people to have happier, fuller, more satisfying lives, and what institutional changes do we need? I think there's a tendency to spend a little too much time in what I'd call the mechanics of the institutions, and to lose sight of who essentially the shareholders or the stakeholders are. We want, in some sense, to increase the efficiency of the Chinese economy. Now, Hong Kong has many great attractions, and one of them, of course, for people from the mainland is it's just a marvelous low-price bazaar, but extremely competitive. And when I say that, it's a way of saying that the mainland is far less competitive. So yes, Chinese imports to the mainland are growing, but it's still a very protected market from goods that would challenge Chinese producers to reduce costs, to produce safer products and the like. And this gets back to the level of protection, the level of tariffs, the procurement practices of the state-owned enterprises, and it gets back to the price of the RMB. So if I were asked if I could only change one price, what, in order to enhance the welfare of Chinese households, I would say, please God, give me the opportunity to increase the price of the RMB by 3% a year for the next 5 years. It's absolutely, forgive me, ludicrous, that's spelled with capital letters, for the Chinese savings, for 4 trillion of Chinese savings to buy US Treasury bills. We don't need the money. Those savings can be used to enhance the welfare of Chinese residents and to enhance the welfare of individuals with much lower standards of living elsewhere in China. Let me just conclude with a note. I think my own government has been foolish with respect to the Chinese initiative on a new Asian infrastructure investment bank. And we should figure out, thank you very much. A little more, please. We should figure out some way to make it less embarrassing for the government to change its policy. If Chinese wish to use their savings to enhance the welfare of individuals in Indonesia, Vietnam, poor Nepal, etc., God bless them. God bless them. but Chinese savings should be used to enhance the living standards in the rural parts of China as well. Thank you very much.
We have something like 3 minutes left. But am I allowed to let somebody from the audience ask a question? Yes, sir. Could you state your name and ask a brief
Jack
question?
Cheung from Treasury Market Association. I have 3 questions for Helen. But those are very simple questions. I think we are both great believers of the RMBI. We're a great believer of this country. We know that this generation is going to see a once-in-a-lifetime great opportunity ahead. But I'm concerned about how can people, this young generation, how can they prepare themselves to jump on that bandwagon? Since we are also alumni of this university, so I'm more concerned about university in Hong Kong, in particular Hong Kong U. So how can the university, in particular Hong Kong U, prepare the student and prepare ourselves for this great era? And since we live in Hong Kong, it's still a very livable city, it's a very lovable city after traveling so many places in the world. So how can Hong Kong prepare itself for this challenge? We know that China is moving ahead slowly, still behind those great countries, but we know that step by step, one travel far. And we know the challenge ahead, but we would like to hear your comment on those 3 simple questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jack. The first one is the younger generation, education. The second one I catch is how does Hong Kong prepare itself? So what's the third?
The second one is about university.
Oh, university. Okay. Chairman, very big questions. I will spend some time with Jack off this stage later on, maybe. But I mean, being an alumni and a Hong Kong person, maybe I'll just say very, very simple thing, my own belief. I think this is a great forum, and thanks to Victor, thanks to President, Vice Chancellor, to have this one. I thought if RMBI is interesting, I thought shadow banking is even more interesting. When we talk about how China funds itself. So something like this, or actually getting this sort of subjects into really the courses will be very, very good. I think there will be a lot of markets people who will be willing to come back and do some sort of side lectures and sharing. So I think that would be something that we can do for the university. For the younger generation, obviously, we really can't focus just on Hong Kong. Always encourage younger people to consider having a job elsewhere in the world. China is a place, not a lot of hardship, I guarantee you. I've been there 5.5 years, working in Shanghai. If you are interested, any graduates interested to look for a job in China, let me know. And I think that's really important because I think we just talk about China, the AIIB and all that. And it's so simple. China just have to continue to grow. Otherwise, how do we actually get the 1.3, 1.4 billion people to middle class? This is what we want to do. So anything, I mean, even if we talk about RMB being internationalized, it is really coming from need. You can imagine if the middle class started to think about investing in the rest of the world, would they not prefer to actually use RMB to do it? So simply put, it's a need. How does Hong Kong prepare ourselves? Hong Kong has always been really a center for China, and in RMBI, the process of it, Hong Kong has been doing the biggest role so far. I think even other parts of the world are developing capabilities to handle RMB. I think Hong Kong still stands the biggest advantage, knowing the culture, knowing the development, always being the first to experiment new products and all that. I think the future for Hong Kong very much hinges on where we would be able to continue to maintain our competitiveness versus the rest of the world in capturing all these opportunities come out of China. Thank you.
We're going to stop here, and I will ask you all to join me in thanking the panel for a very interesting discussion.